Welcome to everybody, and thank you for your message, Bex. I hope you do enjoy the webinar. My name is Leslie Stevenson. I'm the publisher of Governance, and we're bringing you this webinar today with Alison Gill and Alex Edmonds, based on Alex's new book that he's just written, or just published, I should say. Just to introduce us, if you haven't already gone to our website, Governance Publishing offers a lot of free resources on governance, pulls together stuff from all over the place. So please do go and visit us. We have a monthly free newsletter that goes out, which just is a sort of a rough update on what's going on. And we also have a paid for journal. So you can sign up for free to the interim newsletter, also new journal, if you want to go into more depth and have articles by leading experts like Alex and Ali, both of whom have had articles in the last couple of issues. We will be taking questions as you go. If I could ask you to post them in the Q&A, and we will pause as appropriate. And with no more ado, it's just delighted to have so many of you. No more ado, I'm going to hand over to Alison. Thanks, Alison.
Thanks, Leslie, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I can see some familiar names, which is great. So, first of all, I'm Alison Gill. I am the CEO of Bavalco. We specialise in board effectiveness reviews and developing boards. And I'm really delighted to have Alex Edmonds here today with us, because one of the topics that I'm interested in as a psychologist is how we can help boards develop, particularly their thinking, their ability to challenge the information that's given to them, their ability to help boards develop really good strategy, and to think about risk management and how that can impact the organisation. So I want to frame our conversation today very much in the context of boards, non-exec directors and organisations. But Alex's book has been written very much in the broader context of individual smart thinking, organisational smart thinking, and society smart thinking. So I won't constrain him, but just sort of keep that. I like to keep some target on the topic of the board. Welcome, Alex. And as Leslie said, please do put questions into the Q&A, and we will answer them as we go. The plan for today is I'm just going to get us started by asking Alex a few questions. And then we'll very much respond to the things that come up to us live, and very keen that you get what you want to understand the topic more clearly. So, Alex, obviously the main sort of theme of your book is around smart thinking, and particularly you focus on confirmation bias and black and white thinking as being two kind of core elements of smart thinking. Perhaps you could just start by giving us some sort of definitions of what you mean by confirmation bias and black and white thinking.
Certainly. Well, actually, before I'll answer the question, just to say a big thank you to Leslie for hosting us. Thank you to you, Ali, for interviewing me, but also thank you to everybody for taking an hour out of their busy day to hear our discussion. So what I start with in the book, as you say, is highlighting the biases that cause everybody, even some senior people at the boardroom level, to suffer from misinformation. And so one of these biases is confirmation bias. So what is that? That is the idea that we have a pre-existing view of the world. So for me, it might be the view that sustainable organizations always perform better because a lot of my work is on the benefits of sustainability. And so if I have that pre-existing view, if there is a new study which comes out that supports that view, I will latch onto that. I might share it with my fellow board members. I might share it with the rest of the organization, even without scrutinizing it. And if there was an article which said the opposite, hey, sometimes sustainability can be too excessive, it can be at the expense of returns, I would bury it, I wouldn't believe it myself, and I certainly wouldn't share it with anybody, either internally within my organization or on LinkedIn or other forms of social media. Okay, so that's confirmation bias. And so that applies when I have a pre-existing view on something, which I do for sustainability because I work on this topic. But you might think, well, aren't there many, many topics under which I might have no pre-existing view? So maybe I don't feel too passionately about capital structure, the choice between debt and equity. But black and white thinking argues that even if you have no pre-existing view, you are predisposed to thinking that something is always good or always bad. So if there's a new study which came out which said debt is always bad, because it leads to bankruptcy costs, then I might latch onto this and try to have as little debt as possible. And if in contrast to a study which said debt is always good, because debt leads to tax shields, it leads to greater discipline for management teams, then I might also latch onto that. So we see the world in black and white terms, we don't see shades of grey and nuances. And so I think these are two twin biases which apply to the general population. But as you highlighted, Ali, they also apply even for senior members of a boardroom or a management team.
So there's sort of something about the simplicity for us in terms of how beliefs shape, and our beliefs shape the way that we approach problem solving, and also the simplicity of that kind of black and white kind of dichotomy that makes it easier, makes it think it's easier to solve problems in that way. Is that something sort of underpinning that kind of philosophy?
You're absolutely right, Ali. And I think simplicity is a cause. And this is why actually these biases get so ingrained. Because one might think, well, shouldn't evolution mean that we should be cured of our biases? But actually, simplicity is really useful in daily life. So if you cast our minds back to our hunter-gatherer ancestors, they needed to make really snap decisions at scale. So sometimes these will be life and death situations. So if you see an animal, what you do, they might have a simple black and white rule, such as run from all carnivores, who you can identify because they have sharp teeth and eyes at the front of their head. And so sometimes a simple black and white decision might lead to mistakes, because sometimes you would run from a dog. Maybe you could have domesticated the dog and the dog helps for the hunt. But in a life or death situation, it's better to have a simple decision, and even if it leads to the odd mistake. Nowadays, we're not in as many life or death situations, so we don't have the importance of speed so much, but we do have the challenge of scale. So directors and executives have to deal with a huge amount of information, and we cannot evaluate every single thing in an isolated way. So we will generally use simple black and white rules because they help us to deal with complexity. So again, as a practical example, from a sustainability angle, let's say you're managing a sustainable portfolio, you could invest in maybe thousands of companies. You can't analyze every single one, but if you had a simple black and white rule, such as avoid fossil fuel companies, that makes your decision process easier. And maybe 80–90% of the time that leads to the right answer. But maybe there are situations in which you have a fossil fuel company which is really developing clean energy, is on the forefront of doing this. And so sometimes you might make a mistake. So I think biases get in here because of simplicity, and simplicity is not bad. Sometimes, and most of the time, it is good. But what I'm trying to highlight is that if you want to be the most effective manager or director, maybe to get decisions right 80% of the time will only be as good as the competition. To be one step ahead, let's say we can go for 85% or 90%.
Yeah. So there's a thing about being aware of how these confirmation bias and black and white thinking might impact you personally, and impact the groups that you're working in. Just before we get into that in a little bit more detail, because there are some really important tips and techniques that you include in your book. In fact, one of the things I really liked about the book was the amount of techniques that you include and checklists that you include to help people. So we perhaps will go into those in a bit more detail. But before we start that, could we just understand, it'd be really interesting to understand your motivation to write this book. So what is it that got you into the territory of confirmation bias and black and white thinking?
Thanks. So my day job is as a professor of finance, so producing academic research. Now, 95% of professors, all they want to do is write academic papers and publish them in academic journals. But for me, what I'm really passionate about is using this research to solve real-world problems. So that's why I love doing webinars like this with practitioners. I'm on a board myself, and sometimes on advisory councils, even if they're not formal boards. And I'm often talking to practitioners about the findings of research, not just my papers, but the papers by other scholars and other scientists. But what I found since the 11 years since I moved back to the UK and started getting involved in policy is often people would respond to research not based on its rigor, but based on whether they liked its findings. So if there was a study which showed what people wanted to be true, it was the world's best paper. And I wouldn't even call my own papers the world's best. And if in contrast, you found a study which had some inconvenient, uncomfortable conclusion, people would dismiss it and say, oh, it's just an academic study. There's no relevance for the real world. So I thought then if not just me, but the scientific community in general just kept pumping out research, but lots of that research just never actually cut through because people's biases are stopping them from running through, then actually you've got lots and lots of great research which is not actually having any effect. So I thought, well, let's just write a book about the danger of confirmation bias, but as you highlighted, Alan, really appreciate your comment, how to overcome it as a busy practitioner who doesn't have the time to look at every single footnote, who might not have a PhD in statistics. How can we create smart thinking organizations and have simple questions to ask ourselves to see whether we can actually believe a conclusion of a study?
Okay, so sort of real kind of practical, both your sort of academic rigor and then the sort of lining up and parallel world of practical, which is often a comment you get when you start working with organizations is, don't talk to me about research, talk to me about the practical applications, which can be a challenge if you really want to make sure that the information you're giving is rigorous. Can sometimes be a challenge for consultants or advisors like ourselves. But a good question in the chat. So Rebecca Gantz has asked, how do you bring an understanding of confirmation biases around the board table into light so that we can be more consciously aware of them when making decisions?
Great question, and it's great we already have Q&A. I just love to encourage people to chime in with further questions if you have any. So in a couple of ways. So one, not board formally, but advisory committee I'm on is for Royal London Asset Management. So I've been there for 8 years. We have a number of sustainable funds. And the role of the advisory committee is to scrutinize particular investment decisions to ascertain whether they are sustainable, whether they have a place in a sustainable fund. And what it used to be was you had a research note from the internal team, which would do everything they tell you about good writing, which is you begin with the punchline, you don't leave it to the end like a mystery novel. So they would say, we believe we should exclude this stock. Then they would go through all the reasons for, and the reasons against, and say, well, we think we should exclude because the cons outweigh the pros. And that's also similar to what an equity research report does. It says strong buy, then it gives the analysis. But then this had huge confirmation bias. Why? Because for me as an external member, if I saw that the internal team already said exclude, I would unintentionally read the report, overweighting the negatives and underweighting the positives because I knew that somebody had already said that we should exclude. And so even though I was asked to give my own view, my view was slightly twinged by the fact that there was a status quo. So based on my suggestion about the importance of confirmation bias, we no longer do this. So the internal notes will have the pros and the cons, and then the final paragraph, it will have the internal team's recommendation. But by that time, I have already formed my own view, and then I can compare my view to the internal team's view. And then in the meeting, then we have a discussion. So that's one example. There's tons of others, but let me, because I don't want to hog this question, let me just give one more example, because I think it's a great question by Rebecca. Another board I'm on, and this is not a corporate board, this is the board of the American Finance Association, which is my profession's body. Often what you have is in between meetings, you need certain decisions to be approved. So sometimes the president of the association, which is like the equivalent of the chair, will say, I believe that X should be appointed for this vacant position. Do people agree? And then people will fall over themselves to reply all, to say how much they think this is a great appointment. Why? They want to say encouraging things to the president, and they want to convey their positivity. But what this means is that if there was somebody who had concerns, it's really difficult for you to express them. Again, because of confirmation bias, you've already seen the status quo. So this is ironic that we act in this way, because there's a landmark economic paper about something which is known as an informational cascade. So what is this? Often people think, why do people not dissent? Because they're afraid to, because there's a stigma associated with dissent. Now, that is true in many circumstances, but what's really interesting about informational cascades is even if there is zero stigma to expressing a different view, people might self-censor. Why? Because if I come to the email thread late, I see there's already 5 people approving, and I have deep respect for my fellow board members, I will think, yes, I myself wasn't that positive, but I respect my colleagues. If they are positive, then they've probably seen something that I'm not seeing. So I will actually vote yes as well. I'm not going to go with my own opinion. Again, not because I'm scared, not because I'm afraid to dissent, but because out of my respect for my colleagues. And so what that means is that you don't have a diversity of thought. So again, based on my suggestion, we've now reformed the voting procedures where now the votes will be anonymous. And then if after that there is sort of no unanimity or not closer, then we will have a live discussion about this. But this again is something to give space for people to express different viewpoints.
Okay, so you're sort of saying a couple of things there. One is that the statement, starting with a statement, can lead you to that kind of confirmation bias. And the second is that there's a social element to this, which is that if I'm in a group of people that I know well and I have a high degree of respect for their intellectual capacity, their experiences, then I'm more likely to perhaps be unconsciously lazy in my own thinking.
Yeah, so that's right. And again, we often think, okay, these biases, this means that people are bad people, but it's not. It can be just out of deep respect for others that you want to put some weight on other people's viewpoints. You might think, well, I'm missing something if everybody else is positive. It's just like the famous example of if people start leaving a cinema thinking that there's smoke, even if you don't smell smoke at all, you think, well, am I missing something that everybody else is noticing? And so you will leave and evacuate the cinema, even if you don't see any issue there.
Probably not a bad idea.
Yeah, and again, why? Because you are actually, it's not because you're a biased person who's entrenched in your view. Instead, you want to learn from other people, but sometimes the processes are such that you do have a valuable opinion, which you should be expressing. But as you mentioned, Ali, it depends on how people are expressing it. If you're asking a question but not giving a potential answer, then that's much more likely to elicit your response. But if an answer has already been given, be it exclude in the internal team's report or a chain of yeses in terms of reply alls, then that's something where you will perhaps not be using your independent viewpoint.
Okay, and so a couple of things that you've sort of said in terms of techniques that people can think about are to make sure that your perhaps reports into the board, particularly proposals for things, don't start with that statement, but rather start analysis of the pros and cons, and then conclude with any recommendations, so that, as you say, it sort of encourages that kind of mental agility and encourages you to kind of start to formulate your own opinions. So that would be one way. And then the other way that you said is about the anonymous voting. So you take out actually the idea that I can think about, well, who do I know that thinks so much, that I think's an expert in this area and might know more than me? Because I often find that a lot in boards, people get hired for a particular area of expertise. And so they unconsciously sort of defer their own view or subvert their own view to others who they think might have more expertise in a particular topic. So it actually takes out the diversity of viewpoints in the conversation quite early for the wrong reasons.
I think these are really interesting comments. So on your first comment, so this is somewhat akin to the scientific method used in academia. And I'm saying this not to talk my own book. So I think there's many things in academia which don't really work. But I think there are some things which can be useful in the boardroom, in the real world. And so what is the scientific method? We start with a particular question and then we test it. And then we're open-minded as to what we will find. Just like I will start reading this report on the stock and I don't know which way it's going to go. But that is somewhat different from advocacy, which is where you start with a particular conclusion and then you sort of try to find the data to back up that conclusion. And similarly, if I know that this stock has been recommended as an exclude, I will unconsciously sort of overweight the negatives in order for me to reach the same conclusion. Then your second point about the fact that we sometimes people are hired on boards for particular expertise, and this happens to me. For example, I'm on the Novo Nordisk Sustainability Advisory Council. I'm the only economist there. I'm not going to comment on things such as health implications because that's what Lord David Pryor, the former chairman of the NHS, he's clearly much more knowledgeable than me. So on the one hand, we should still try to chime in and not completely self-censor, but also on the other hand, I will respect the greater expertise of others. So it's not that I will try to comment on every single agenda item. So there should be some happy medium behind recognizing that you have some expertise, but also recognizing that a board makes best decisions when you have that expertise sort of playing off and chiming with each other rather than having a set of independent contributions. Often it may well be that my economist angle might add a little bit to the health angle that Lord Pryor is giving.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, the other perspective would be that whilst you might not have the expertise and knowledge, you can help to clarify understanding. So you can play a different role as a board member aside from your expertise is kind of what I'm trying to say, which then helps the thinking because it helps other people make sure they've understood the nuances of the dialogue, the different ways the decision might go to perhaps criticize, challenge and push, but not be necessarily dependent on expertise particularly.
That is a great point. And actually that's why actually lack of expertise can be useful because you can apologize and you say, well, this is not my field, but can you explain why this isn't? And sometimes, not all the time, maybe a minority of times, that question is useful because what they've done is they've made an assumption which is actually perhaps not correct, but in their field it's a fine assumption. So sometimes actually having that questioning and having the latitude to question without feeling that you're asking too simple a question is something which can be really useful. And it goes the other way. Sometimes I remember the last Novo Nordisk meeting, somebody said, oh, far from it for me to be a biologist trying to hold a finance professor to account on executive compensation, but I didn't fully buy into, Alex, your statement as to why X. So
yeah, okay. Now we're talking a bit about diversity of thought and different ways board members can contribute, and Andrew Gambia has put an interesting question in. I'm going to reframe your question slightly, so apologies, Andrew, but I'm just going to say, how do board hiring practices tend to favour people with different views and the courage to express them? Are boards looking to recruit people who just fit in, and how can we perhaps change board practices so that we hire people with diverse views? What can we look for in terms of that, Alex, do you think?
Really good question, and I can answer it partially on the experience that I have on the boards and advisory committees that I'm on, but I recognise I have a limited sample, so I'd love to hear your views, Ali, after I've given my initial thoughts. So there is an increased attention to diversity, which I think is a really good thing, but sometimes diversity is only equated with a demographic diversity, so gender and ethnicity. So there was once I was asked to apply for a board position because they needed more non-white faces, which I thought was mildly insulting, because I think why they should ask me is because hopefully I'm going to bring some useful expertise. Now, sometimes it will be that demographic diversity does translate into cognitive diversity. So there is evidence that women will think differently from men. There might be some consumer-facing organizations where you want a view from both parts of the customer base. But I think cognitive diversity goes much greater than just demographic diversity. And indeed, I have one of my own research papers called Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, which looks at, if you go beyond demographic diversity, you find a much stronger link to performance than if you looked at demographic diversity alone. And that shouldn't be surprising, because the concern with demographic diversity is that gives the impression that if you're a white man, you can never add to the diversity of an organization, even if your background could be humanities and everybody else's background is science. You could be the first in your family to ever go to university. You could have a lot of socioeconomic diversity. So in the UK, there's a huge amount of regional inequality where if you just have a different accent, sometimes people will have a different interpretation. So I think the best hiring practices will not be blind to demographic diversity, but will look at a diversity of different backgrounds and cognitive styles. So for the Royal London Committee, there's only 4 external members. 2 are women and the other 2 are Asian men. But you have me as a governance expert, you have an environmental expert, you have a portfolio manager who's also a pharmaceuticals expert, and then you have one executive, so she's from a corporate. So that's from quite different backgrounds, in addition to our demographic diversity.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things that I do think that boards are getting better at thinking about how they hire diversity into their boards. Not least because of the changes to the corporate governance code, which are encouraging that to happen. But boards have to really change their practice. So the skills matrix is the most common form of looking at a board in terms of what a board might need. And so that just focuses on expertise. It doesn't focus on how people behave, for example. So some people are much more empathetic than others, as an example. Some people are much better facilitators than others. Some people are much more introverted, some people are much more extroverted. So there are lots of different ways of thinking about how you might build the makeup of a board to be more effective. A behavioral perspective, the behavioral makeup of a board can be really powerful, because if a board has real strength in depth in behavior across the different board members, you're much more likely to get a high performing board. So I sort of encourage that as a method. I really like the anonymous voting when you're hiring new board directors. I think that helps enormously, because it doesn't bias people's views and encourages people to say what they really think and feel. And I do think that fit matters. But fit can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily mean that we like someone. It means we value what this person can bring. And sometimes people might feel like they don't fit to start with, but that's about developing the board to work together in a mature sense. So Robin, hope that gives you some sort of answers.
I think that was fascinating for me. So Annie, have you seen sort of the equivalent of a skills matrix, but for like a personality matrix or cognitive style matrix? So on the one hand, you might think, okay, directors don't want to see this. So I know the skills matrix for the Investor Forum, and my skills are listed in some places, not others. I'm happy with that. But if people were saying oh, this person's more argumentative and this person's a better sort of consensus builder, like to me, I wouldn't mind that, because I think it's useful to be transparent. But have you seen that work in boardrooms, even if it's not shared among the board more generally? Can it be just can the nominating committee see something like that, or the chair?
Yeah, so I think increasingly boards are getting more sophisticated about the type of tools that they use, A, to assess people, and B, to develop themselves, to understand more about the sophistication of themselves as human beings and how that impacts on their abilities to make decisions. I'm a big fan of using leadership ego maturity profiling, because that tells you a lot about actually the construct of how people experience the world, and therefore the type of thinking they're likely to bring into a group environment. And so the board can really work on the sophistication of how it views the world, if you like. And that really helps with complex problem solving. So there are lots of different tools that are available, and boards are getting more experiential in terms of how they think and experience kind of their own makeup and what that means. And inevitably, diverse boards are much more difficult because they have to be facilitated really well. So it puts a lot more onus on the chair to do a great job. Great, so let's move on. A really important question from Hayley Hewson here about what are your views on confirmation bias training for the board of directors? Do you have any experience of that?
Well, I might have confirmation bias in my response. So hey, it's a great question. I think it's really valuable, but that could be my own confirmation bias. But sort of stepping aside, I think that there are many situations in which companies might make poor decisions because of confirmation bias. So I do think it is very serious. So one example I give in the book is Silicon Valley Bank, where their own internal models predicted that if interest rates rose, then they would lose a lot because they were heavily invested in treasury bills and bonds. But they thought, no, we're great at making decisions. So if the models are predicting this, the models must be wrong. So let's change the assumptions of the models. And that could have also been the case in the financial crisis, where people were taking a lot of risk betting on subprime mortgages, but people were thinking, well, this is safe as houses. So I think this training will be really useful. I haven't experienced it in terms of formal training myself, but certainly there have been either boards or committees where I have suggested, can we do things in a different way, such as put the recommendation of the internal team to the end, have a different way of voting, of aggregating information. It might well be that sometimes more formal training will be used, like at least I think in the cases in which I've been involved, because I am somewhat recognized as somebody with knowledge and confirmation bias, then people don't feel that they need to go to an external person. They're quite happy, and I appreciate them doing so to go with my suggestions. But if there are particular boards where there isn't anybody with that background, then it might be useful to get some formal training. And the people who do these board effectiveness reviews, I don't know to what extent they will be looking at confirmation bias or the ability of people to have an expressed dissenting viewpoints.
As a board reviewer, I could say I'd like to think we do some of that, but we may well be open to our own confirmation bias inevitably. But I think it's a really fantastic idea, and I would again I point you at the book. There are some fantastic training tools in the book, and I noticed towards the end of the book you talk about developing your way of thinking, Alex, and I wonder if you might talk about that a little bit.
Developing my way, you mean? Or
yeah, developing a way of thinking, I think you described it. So you talk about challenging what we believe, what we'd like to be, listen open-mindedly, and stay alert to our own biases. I seem to remember those as being 3 tips to improving the quality of thinking.
Yes, and I think here what's just valuable is to recognize that often when you get to a board level, you think, well, why have I been appointed to the board? Because I have a lot of expertise, and absolutely you do. But the world is such a complicated place, and no matter how much expertise you have, there's lots of different things that you won't know. And it's a bit like, say, looking at a picture or a building from different perspectives. You might have a really sharp perspective from where you're standing, but somebody else is standing from another perspective. And it's to try to make sure that you can have as many different viewpoints as possible for a particular decision. And this is something I will try to do myself. I won't always get it right, but even outside the boardroom, the agent that I went with for this book, I had about 8 agents offering me representation, and this was the agent who was the most critical about my proposal. I thought, well, that's great, because it means that he will challenge me and push me, and he's also willing to express his views openly rather than trying to say it's a great book in order for me to sign with him. And even after I finished the book, I then sent it to people who I trusted to criticize me by saying, well, can you just give me some suggestions on how I can make this book better? So I think the idea of trying to always constantly challenge yourself is useful. Now, sometimes when I get all of that feedback in, some concerns, I might actually not act on the basis of them, because I will recognize that I have actually worked on the book for maybe 18 months, and maybe the person spent a couple of weeks reading it. So it doesn't mean that you're swinging in the wind and you can never have your own opinion or use your own expertise. But I want to gather these other viewpoints and take them seriously. And some I will absolutely incorporate, and others I might think, okay, I can understand where they're coming from, but this is why I think actually the way it's being done is the best way to do it.
So there's sort of some discipline involved, isn't there, in thinking about different perspectives, critically thinking and challenging proposals that are put in front of you. And I love that analogy of seeing the building from different perspectives. You know, if I'm if I'm in an aeroplane in the sky, the building looks quite different to if I'm standing by the front door. It looks different in sunlight, it looks different in rain. So things look differently depending on the angle and the context through which you view them. And having that ability to take different perspectives can be a really powerful thing to develop in a board.
Absolutely, and I know this is something where I'm still developing, and I think I've had my board position for maybe only 2 years, and it's still something which is really big learning. But I think it's really interesting, and it's a really fascinating thing to try to learn that and how to do that more effectively yourself, but also bring that out in other people.
Yeah. Okay, let's answer a couple more questions in the live Q&A. Robin Blackstone asks, does social media like LinkedIn or others commonly used in business tend to emphasize both confirmation bias and black and white thinking?
It absolutely does. And so why does it? Because what is the business model of a social media company, be it LinkedIn or X or even Instagram? It's to keep you hooked, because the more hours you spend and the more adverts they can show, and they keep you hooked by showing stuff that you want to be true. So there is scientific evidence that if you see a story, a statement you like, this will release dopamine within the body. It just feels good. And so this is why we live in echo chambers. So often in my social media feeds, I will see stuff that confirms what I'd like to be true. And also, if you have people who will comment on something on LinkedIn, they will typically be commenting to reinforce what that person is saying. Why? Like it could be that they're just supportive people, and it's not that they're bad people, they just want to be supportive. Or it could be that they think, well, let me build my good reputation. So it's the person's much more likely to appreciate it if you say, great article, and I appreciate that myself, rather than saying, oh, here are lots of problems with this. Sometimes if people were to raise concerns, it can be that the person who made the original post will just delete it. And so you spend a lot of time crafting it to be deleted, or they come up with something defensive and accuse you of something bad. For example, if I was to say, well, actually, the data on demographic diversity improving board performance is actually quite weak, it's cognitive diversity, and they might say, okay, that's because you're racist or sexist towards me. They'll impugn different motives. So what then does that mean for social media? And I'm saying this as much to myself as I am to other people. Well, first, if you've written a post and then there's a comment and a challenge to it, to take it seriously, if it's expressed in a constructive way, and to reply to it. And even if you disagree with it, just to try to say, okay, I understand your point, I view these things differently for these reasons. Sometimes it's actually to concede. So there have been times where people have highlighted mistakes in my original post. The tempting thing to do is to edit the original post and then delete the comment to suggest that I made it correctly all along. But no, I will reply and say, I have edited the comment in the light of your concern. You're absolutely right, and I'll keep that there. So they know that it was worth them challenging. Other people who see that comment will realize that I appreciate being held to the standards that I'm trying to uphold and promote myself. And then as somebody who's making that comment, if you do see a statement which you know not to be true based on the evidence, can you do this can you comment on this, but also do this as constructively as possible? So when I comment on things like demographic diversity, I will say, actually, here the evidence is weak, but this is not to say that diversity initiatives are not good. It's to say, well, when you look at diversity, we need to look beyond gender and ethnicity to other things such as skills and personality styles. So put it in a way which is most likely to be received and viewed constructively rather than as an ideological attack.
So you make some really valid points there, which I think a lot of boards could learn from, which is the idea of include. So integrate thinking as opposed to the need to be right. I think, if critical challenge comes and you can integrate that into your thinking, then you're starting to develop that habit of what you call smart thinking.
Yes, absolutely. And so what is smart thinking? It is critical thinking. So smartness is to recognize that while you are smart, there's many things that you don't know as well. And so how can I try to learn as much as possible and to gather as much information I can to help me make this important decision? And this is to try to have time and space for people to express different viewpoints.
Brilliant. So that's a brilliant segue to our next question. Irvin Nels from Namibia. I'm not sure if I pronounced your name right, so I apologise if I haven't. But you ask, how do we ensure diversity of thought in our decision-making process at a board level?
So I think it's number one in terms of the composition of the board to begin with, to make sure that you have a mix of people which has not just demographic diversity, but also cognitive diversity. And cognitive diversity can be in both in terms of experiential background, but also in terms of cognitive style. So some people like to challenge a lot, and other people like to make sure that they're highlighting the consensus, because if you just had challenges, you would never move forward. But then to be deliberate about not just diversity, but equity and inclusion. So we have the phrase diversity, equity, inclusion, and often people only think about diversity and don't think about the other. So they have what I call a add diversity and stir approach, where you basically just hire diverse people into the boardroom and then just let them do their thing. But can we do certain things intentionally in order to encourage this diversity of thought? So I've already given two examples earlier on in response to, I think it was Rebecca's question. Let me give you a third example, which is, let's say there was a board meeting and people are suggesting, well, let's go with plan X. And let's say one person, Emma, let's call her, says, well, I have actually got some concerns about X. And maybe the rest of the boardroom listens to those concerns, takes them seriously, and say, okay, we hear the concerns, but we think we should still go ahead because of all of these reasons. So afterwards, if the chair of that meeting goes to Emma afterwards and says, I want you to know that I really appreciate you speaking up. And even though we still went with plan X, when we implement it and execute it, we will bear your concerns in mind. So why is that so useful? Sometimes in some boards, it is difficult to challenge. And I have been in boards myself where it has been really uncomfortable and you are looked down on and you're seen as an inconvenience by asking questions. And so Emma might think, well, the next time I spent all my political capital challenging this. Perhaps the people who were the proponents of Plan X are now in their bad books because I was in their way, and it didn't change the decision anyway, so I just delayed the decision by 15 minutes or half an hour, which could have been used to discuss other things. So the next time she has some concerns, she might self-censor. But if the chair says, no, the board that I am chairing is one that we are really wanting to hear different viewpoints. And even if this doesn't change the actual decision, we want to make sure that there is a process in place that when the challenge is actually very valid and it will change the decision, we will want to make sure that there's airtime. So it was one example of that. I was on a board where we were, actually, let me say up front what it was. It was the London Business School governing body. So the governing body is a bit like the board of directors, and I was elected as a faculty representative. And so directors' terms are 3 years, and then they have to be reappointed. And so the chair said, okay, now it's David's reappointment. Let's pretend that David is not in the room. Does anybody does anybody object to David's reappointment? And clearly nobody would, right? Because David was in the room. And so one colleague, I wish I could credit myself for it, it wasn't me, it was my colleague, said, I have no objections in this situation. Clearly, David is a no-brainer to be reappointed, so I can understand why you don't want to go through the big rigmarole of getting to leave and come back in for a decision which is a no-brainer. But for good governance and good practice, we always need to make sure that the person's out of the room, because the next time, where the next decision is not as unanimous, we want to make sure that we're able to express these different viewpoints. once I was on the executive committee of the European Finance Association, where my own reappointment was being discussed. So I was the managing editor of the journal. I had just given my presentation and the chair said, "Oh, you've done an amazing job. We're here to discuss your reappointment." And I said I should leave the room. And he said, no, there's no need for you to leave the room. Stay. I said, no, I'm going to leave the room. He said, no, I'm telling you, you should stay. And I said, I don't care. I'm going to leave the room. And I walked out of the room. Again, if my reappointment is being discussed, I want people to make sure that they can discuss this freely. Okay, it delayed a bit of the meeting. I had to go out and then somebody had to come and bring me back in. But the process needs to be there, that if in the future there is a decision which is not a no-brainer, then that process can be followed.
That's really helpful. So you sort of talking about appreciation of challenge. There's a really important role the chairman can play in terms of encouraging publicly and privately people to contribute in that way. And then again, coming back to the process that encourages people to really speak freely and openly as being good practice. I guess the other thing I'm sort of thinking about, one of the challenges for boards often is the idea that consensus is a good decision-making mechanism. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how consensus as a decision-making tool can perhaps inhibit or make worse confirmation bias and black and white thinking.
Yeah, so if you're a consensus-oriented board, then this could lead to groupthink. So groupthink is the idea that we want to support whatever decision we think that group is going to is supporting. And if there are certain boards or committees which need unanimity, then you don't want to deviate because you are seen as getting in the way, you are seen as maybe a buzzkill for the board, you're just an inconvenience. But if you don't need consensus, but maybe a majority vote or super majority vote, you can still express dissent, and so that dissent will hopefully be taken into account in the implementation, but it doesn't actually get in the way of making decisions. I think another problem with requiring consensus is that will lead to only the most conservative decisions and incremental decisions being made, because those are the ones in which you are going to get support by everybody. Sometimes there might be decisions where there will be winners and losers. So sometimes with an innovation might lead to some jobs being lost, or some people having to be reallocated, or some customers might not be happy with that innovation. But I think if the requirement is for everybody to be happy with the decision, there will be many decisions which are really good decisions which you're not going to go ahead with. So you certainly should take into account the people who will lose from a decision, who have concerns with it, and they should absolutely feel free to express those concerns. But it can be that sometimes you go ahead even if there's no consensus, if you've had sort of a majority or supermajority voting protocol in place.
Yeah, so it's a kind of conundrum, I think, for boards often, that the idea that there needs to be consensus, and as you say, it can hamper innovation potentially, and perhaps more bigger strategic decisions.
Yeah, and then to Andrew's earlier point is that, well, then who are you going to be hiring to the board to begin with? It's those who fit in, who are likely to build consensus, because that's the way in which you make decisions.
Yeah, and I just wanted to take you now to a tool that is in your book, which I thought was really helpful, which is the ladder of misinference. And I wonder if you might talk us through that as a sort of deepening our knowledge about how confirmation bias occurs.
Absolutely. So we started this conversation with the biases, and then the next part of the book is, well, how to deal with these biases, how to tackle this. What are the forms of misinformation that we might fall into because of our biases? And before I wrote the book, I read other books on misinformation, which are good. I'm not going to rag on those books, and because I feel them as competitors, they were good and informative. And in fact, the problem was they were so comprehensive that they were difficult to put into practice, because they would say, here's the 159 ways in which we could fall for misinformation. And then as a busy professional, you can't remember all 159 and put them into practice. So I wanted to categorize misinformation into just 4 types. And those 4 types I illustrate with something I call the ladder of misinference. And why do I call it a ladder? You might start with certain facts and then draw conclusions from them and make a decision. But often when you're drawing conclusions from facts, you're walking up that ladder. Sometimes the rungs of the ladder might be broken. So that's why I call it the ladder of misinference. So let me go through the 4 steps in turn, and let me try to use boardroom examples. So the first step in the ladder is a statement is not fact because it may not be accurate. So what do I mean by this? So boards often will make statements and quote statements and assume they're fact because the statements are authoritative and often by some respected people, but they might not be accurate. So one example is this very famous phrase by Peter Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Plays into black and white thinking, like culture is always better, and probably also plays into confirmation bias. We like to think that the softer things matter. And my research does suggest that as well. But number one, Peter Drucker never said culture eats strategy for breakfast. And number two, even if he did, was there evidence behind it? Did he conduct a study showing that culture improves firm performance more than strategy, or was it just a hunch? And yes, even if it's a hunch, we should put some weight on it because Peter Drucker is a respected management guru. But in Peter Drucker's subjective opinion, culture is better than strategy. That is quite different from the very definitive statement that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Sometimes that might lead a board to spend 75% of their time on culture and 25% of their time on strategy, or even worse. So the second part of the ladder is that facts are not data. They may not be representative. So let's say you've avoided the first misstep. You've checked the quote or whatever. You've checked that it is fact-based. Sometimes, even if a fact is 100% accurate, it might be misleading because it's a hand-picked example. It's an exception that does not prove the rule. So let's take the third most viewed TED Talk of all time by Simon Sinek. It led to his book called Start With Why. And this argues that the secret to success is for a company to have a why. And increasingly boards are focusing much more on having a purpose. And my first book, Grow the Pie, was on the importance of purpose. So I want that to be true. And Simon Sinek gives some examples. He says Apple was successful. It started with why, and it's clearly a successful company. Nobody can dispute that fact. And even if you're in a non-profit, like Wikipedia, clearly successful. It's it eclipsed the Encyclopedia Britannica as the world's fountain for knowledge. But even though those 2 examples are 100% accurate, they are handpicked. There could be hundreds of other examples of companies which started with why and then failed because they build their business plan on sort of a hunch rather than on some bricks. And I think this is, very important because we often love to learn as boards from case studies, from success stories, but actually it's really difficult to highlight, is this truly the secret sauce for success, without considering hundreds of other companies which also follow that recipe to see whether they succeeded or failed. And this is not just me ragging on Simon Sinek. There's a lot of really influential business books, many of which I've read myself, like Jim Collins's book, Built to Last, or Good to Great, or the book In Search for Excellence, or the book Firms of Endearment, which will identify some successful companies and then try to reverse engineer the principles that they used, but without seeing the hundreds of other companies which also use those principles, many of which might have failed. We don't really know whether those principles were the drivers. So then you might think, well, isn't the solution to get all the data, to see the full picture, not just the selected sample? Well, the answer is no, because of the third misstep up the ladder, which is data is not evidence. It may not be conclusive. So what do I mean by this? So what's the difference between data and evidence? Because these terms are often used interchangeably. Data is just a collection of facts, but evidence points to one conclusion. So where do we hear the word evidence a lot? A criminal trial. Evidence is only evidence if it suggests one suspect. If the evidence suggests that any Tom, Dick, or Harry could have committed the crime, it's not evidence. And so if we were to find large-scale data that sustainable companies perform better, that might not be evidence, because one suspect is sustainability causes a company to perform better. I want that to be true as a sustainability advocate, but maybe it's the opposite. Maybe once a company is already performing well, then it can invest in sustainability. Or maybe there are third factors that affect both. A great CEO both invests in sustainability, and that great CEO also improves her company's performance. There's no direct link. Fourth and final step is evidence is not proof. It may not be universal. So even if you've nailed down a result that sustainability improves company performance and it is causal, maybe that's not universal. It does not apply elsewhere. So maybe you've studied hundreds of publicly traded companies in the US, but does that apply to Namibia? We have somebody from there. Like, that's a country with maybe different cultural norms and different laws and different institutional details. Does this apply to small companies, privately held firms, not just publicly traded companies? Sometimes what we do is we over extrapolate. So a lot of studies, the criticism is they are on weird people. Now you might think, have I just been offensive by calling people weird? But weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Often the conclusions from weird people might not apply to other countries with different contexts.
Okay, that's really helpful. So really that sort of ladder, that tool is right, this series of steps that you can use to help you think about at what point am I either thinking in too much of a black and white way as opposed to understanding the nuances, or confirming using information to confirm what you think is right or want to believe is right. Is that fair? Is that a fair summary?
That's absolutely right. And actually, if people noticed that I was like typing into the keyboard while you were asking, that wasn't to be rude, Alison, but I just realized that just 34 minutes ago, so just while in this conversation, Harvard Business Review published an article by me just illustrating that ladder. So I recognize that was probably my longest answer to any of your questions. So let me try and put it in the chat here, if I can. That's the hosts and panelists. Let me put it in the Q&A. So I think people, let me put it in if the hosts and panelists, and if there's a way of putting this on the Q&A so that everybody can see it. But if people just look, it's called How to Vet Information Before Making a Decision, in the Harvard Business Review. Literally just came out at 9 a.m. US time, so 2 p.m. our time. It goes through all of those steps.
Okay, brilliant. Now we're coming to the end of our hour. I can't believe we've come to the end of an hour so quickly. This seems to have raced by. It's been a fascinating conversation. We've got one last question. Please define weird again. Oh, we've lost your sound.
Oh, I was actually typing in my response here. Just that's why I put myself on mute. So it's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic.
Brilliant. Well, listen, Alex, I really want to say thank you on behalf of everybody that's attended this webinar. It's been a fantastic journey through sort of confirmation bias and black and white thinking, and the tools that you can use to help your board or yourself improve your thinking. And I love that idea that we need to develop our way of thinking and really practice actually how we ensure that we don't become don't get pulled aside by confirmation and our beliefs, and actually make our decision making better. So thank you very much, Alex.
Thanks so much, Ali. Really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you again to everybody for joining and their active participation in the questions.
Thank you very much, both Ali and Alex. That was, as you said, Ali, the hour just flew past. And thanks to all of you for your questions. I'm never going to think of anyone as being weird in the same way again. So thank you. I did put up your article, Alex. We managed to send that round to everybody. We will be sending a recording, a link to the recording, either tomorrow or Monday. And thank you. And if you've got any ideas or thoughts of other webinars that you'd be interested in, then do please get in touch. So thank you very much, and particularly to you, Ali, and to you, Alex. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Thank you, Leslie, for governance hosting. It's fantastic to have such a great host.
Thank you. That's very kind. All right. Take care of everyone. Bye.